My name is Martin Rees. I'm a professor at Cambridge University, and my speciality is astronomy and space science. Welcome to my exp. Obviously, we need to plan as far ahead as we can, and one of my concerns has been to see if we can make any good, reliable guesses about the future of our environment and our planet and of our technology. And I think to set the backdrop, we know that we are living in a very special century. We know the Earth's been around for 45 million centuries, and that this century is special. It's special because it's the first when one species, namely human beings, has the power to affect the entire planet's fate. And that's because there are more of us on the world than ever before. The world population is now about 7.8 billion, and we're each more demanding of energy and resources. So for the very first time, we are affecting the entire planet. One obvious way in which everyone is familiar that we're changing the planet is that we're changing the climate. The emission of CO2 through the burning of fossil fuels is warming up the Earth in a way that could lead to dangerous tipping points. And one of the things we want to predict is just how serious this will be, how quickly it will happen. And this is one of the most important areas of scientific modeling and prediction. Another related question is whether we can avoid causing mass extinctions, because the biosphere obviously is a complicated and rather delicate system, and if we encroach too much on it, because we need to use more land to grow food, etc., if we change the climate, then of course that will make conditions suboptimal for the existing plants and animals. And one of the big concerns is that we should not only control the change of the climate, but also we should control any despoilation of the natural world by causing mass extinctions. To quote the great ecologist E.O. Wilson, if our generation causes mass extinction, it's a sin that future generations will least forgive us for. We've really got to hope that we can cope with a population which is going to rise even further, almost certainly to 9 billion by mid-century, without encroaching too much on nature and without burning so much fossil fuels that will lead to dangerous climate change. We can predict that the population will rise to about 9 billion, and that's because most of the people in the world are in developing countries and they're young. They're going to live longer and they're going to have their own children. So even if the birth rate falls, the population is going to rise for at least the next 20 or 30 years. We can't predict beyond that stage. We hope it'll start falling, but we can't predict what will happen beyond about 2050. So prediction of the climate and of the population can be made about 20 or 30 years ahead. The other thing we'd like to predict, obviously, is technology. And here again, we can predict a decade ahead, but not all that far ahead. If we think of how we depend at the moment so much on information technology, smartphones and the rest, smartphones would have seen magic as little as 20 years ago, whereas they've spread globally faster than any other prior technology. So if we try to think about 2050, is what I try to do a lot of the time, then we've got to bear in mind that there may be some completely unpredicted technologies which will dominate our lives then, which aren't on our radar at all at the moment. So we can't be sure about how technology will develop. We can, of course, be fairly confident that there will be more powerful computers, etc., and we can hope that there'll be benefits in medical sciences, which have been accelerated, of course, by COVID-19. We hope we'll be able to cope with diseases, etc., and that we'll understand genetics better, and also that we'll be able to make energy without burning fossil fuels. So clean energy and better biotech are two areas of science that we hope will develop. In terms of what we should worry about in the future, then what really gives me nightmares is that these new powerful technologies can be misused, either by error or by design. The reason for that is that if we consider the most devastating technology that was invented in the last century, which was nuclear weapons can't be made without some huge special purpose facilities. They can't be made in a clandestine way that's hard to monitor. So, although we quite rightly worry about nuclear weapons, there are huge danger overhanging the world still, and we've got to make sure that they're properly controlled. We can monitor any facilities where nuclear weapons can be made, because they're large and conspicuous, and the International Atomic Energy Agency does this. But biotech, making engineered viruses even more virulent and transmissible than COVID-19, is something which can be done by people using facilities available in many university or industrial labs. And likewise, computer power and computer networks allows a small group or even a distant individual to cause a cyber attack that could cause really massive devastation, knocking out the power grid in a large region or causing some other global disaster. So one of my worries is how we can control the misuse of these technologies and harness their benefits without feeling too threatened by their downsides. I think it's a big challenge. I think it's going to cause a big tension between three things we want to preserve: privacy, liberty, and security. I think we're going to have to give up a lot of privacy if we want to be sure there's not someone somewhere in the world who is going to be making a clandestine pathogen that could be very dangerous. Of course, there'll be regulations. Academies like the Royal Society, of which I was once president, and its counterparts around the world, they are trying to address what regulations should be imposed on biological developments on grounds of both prudence and ethics. And of course, that's great. But even if these regulations are agreed by all countries, the question is, can they be enforced? We don't have much success in enforcing the drug laws globally or the tax laws globally. And likewise, my nightmare is that we can't enforce the regulations on the use of these dangerous technologies. And that's why I think we will have a bumpy ride through this century. I think COVID-19 has been a wake-up call in that it has shown how vulnerable our global civilization is. It's shown how interconnected we are, and that it is possible for something to happen which can disrupt life all across the world. Of course, we can well imagine events far worse than COVID-19, an event which has the transmissibility of COVID-19, but the fatality rate of, say, Ebola or something like that. So we can fear something still worse that would happen. And we're much more vulnerable. Let me give one example. In the 14th century, we know that Europe suffered bubonic plague, the Black Death, which killed up to half the population of many towns and villages. But the other half went on fatalistically. Now, if we had a pandemic which killed even 1% of the population, then it would overwhelm hospitals and probably lead to a social breakdown, because our expectations are so high. And it's perhaps ominous that COVID-19 has killed about 0.3% of the population in some European countries and in the United States. So 1% would be really catastrophic. And I think we've got to bear in mind that these threats are very hard to cope with, but we can be better prepared and we can be more resilient. One of the issues is a trade-off between resilience and efficiency. What do I mean by this? Well, two examples. First, manufacturing industry here in Europe depends on supply chains coming from the Far East. And if some component can't be produced, if there's one link in one chain that breaks, then that can have a big effect. So I think one lesson that will be learnt is that we should have multiple supply chains. We shouldn't depend on just-in-time delivery. And to give another example, we would have coped better with COVID-19 if all hospitals had kept more spare capacity, hadn't prided themselves, as we in the UK did, on the efficient use of intensive care beds, so there weren't very many in reserve. In Germany, they intentionally kept at least 20 or 25% of beds free in case there was an emergency. So we've got to accept that it's worth spending a bit extra in order to be prepared for an emergency, and also to manage our industry so it's more resilient and doesn't depend on the breakdowns of single long supply chains. So those are lessons we can learn. If we think about the world in 2050, I think it's going to be very important to ensure that inequalities are reduced. Not just the gross inequalities that we have within countries in Europe and the United States, but also the massive inequalities between the North, Europe and North America, and the southern countries, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. I think we've got to ensure that those gaps are narrower, not wider. The reason for that is that sub-Saharan Africa is one of the places that has not yet experienced the so-called demographic transition. The birth rate is still very high, the population is rising there, even though it's levelling off in Europe and North America. And that's going to make it harder for Africa to get out of the poverty trap. Another reason it's going to be harder is that the way in which the East Asian countries, the Asian tigers, as they're sometimes called, developed was by undercutting the manufacturing costs in Europe and North America and having cheap labour so that we bought their goods. That gave a huge boost to places like South Korea and Vietnam and Taiwan. But of course, now robots are taking over manufacturing. So countries in Africa won't have that advantage. That ladder's being kicked away. So I think we've got to make sure that the wealthy nations ensure that countries in Africa can develop industry and develop a better standard of life. And so I think for reasons that aren't purely altruistic, it's very important for us in Europe to ensure that there is a sort of mega Marshall Plan to develop Africa and ensure it catches up rather than falling behind the countries of Europe and the United States.